Tonight I'm going to be talking about the psychology of unbelief, the psychology of atheism, or what might also be called the psychology of those who reject God. In doing this, my major point is to show that one of the criticisms of Christianity can be clearly rebutted. That criticism is that people who believe in God for psychologically unacceptable reasons. I'm sure we've all heard the idea that if you believe in God, it's because you have childish and immature needs, probably of an unconscious kind, that go back to your infancy or your childhood in any case. And it's because of these needs for security, these needs for hope, these needs for understanding, that you believe in God. Now that argument we'll be discussing tonight. But what I want to show is that this argument can be applied also to the unbeliever. That it's not just believers who might have psychological reasons for believing in God. It is also the case that unbelievers have psychological reasons for rejecting God. And when we're through looking at some of those reasons and some of the people who I think exemplify them, I hope we will all agree that in the future, the reasons that we have for believing in God or for not believing in God, the psychological reasons, should be taken off the table as not relevant to discussion. And that it's not just the believer, as I said, who has reasons for belief, although no one's shown that yet, but the unbeliever also has psychological reasons of great, in my judgment, great interest for why they reject God. And with that as a preamble, let me begin. The title of my talk tonight, The Psychology of Atheism, may seem strange to some of you. Certainly my psychological colleagues have found it odd, and even, I might add, a little disturbing. After all, psychology, since its founding roughly a century ago, has often focused on the opposite topic, namely the psychology of religious belief. Indeed, in many respects, the origins of modern psychology are intimately bound up with the psychologists who explicitly proposed interpretations of belief in God. William James and Sigmund Freud, for example, were both personally and professionally deeply involved in the topic. Recall The Will to Believe by James, as well as his famous Varieties of Religious Experience. These two works are devoted to an attempt to understanding belief as the result of psychological, that is, natural causes. James himself might have been quite sympathetic to religion, but his own position, at least his public position, was one of doubt. And his writings were part of psychology's general undermining of religious faith. As for Sigmund Freud, his critiques of religion, in particular Christianity, are well known, and we will discuss them in some detail later. For now, it is enough to remember how deeply involved Freud and his thought have been with the question of God and religion. Given the close involvement between the founding of much of psychology and critical interpretations of religion, it should not be surprising that most psychologists view with some alarm any attempt to propose a psychology of unbelief or of atheism. At the very least, such a project puts many psychologists on the defensive and gives them some taste, if you might say, of their own medicine. Psychologists are always observing and interpreting others, and it is time that some of them learn from their own personal experience what it is like to be put under the microscope of psychological theory and experiment. Regardless, I hope to show that the psychological concepts used quite effectively to interpret religion are two-edged swords that can also be used to interpret atheism. Sauce for the believer is equally sauce for the unbeliever. Before beginning, however, I wish to make 2 points bearing on the underlying assumptions of my remarks. First, I assume that the major barriers to belief in God are not rational, but in a general sense can be called psychological. Now, in postulating a universal Oedipus complex as the origin of all our neuroses, Freud inadvertently developed a straightforward rationale for understanding the wish-fulfilling origin of rejecting God. After all, the Oedipus complex is unconscious. It is established in childhood, and above all, its dominant motive is hatred of the father and desire for him not to exist, especially as represented by the desire to overthrow or kill him. Freud regularly described God as a psychological equivalent to the father, and so a natural expression of Oedipal motivation would be powerful unconscious desires for the non-existence of God. Therefore, in the Freudian framework, atheism is an illusion caused by the Oedipal desire to kill the father and replace him with oneself. To act as if God does not exist is an obvious, not very subtle disguise for a wish to kill him. Much in the same way as in a dream, the image of a parent going away or disappearing can represent such a wish. God is dead is simply an undisguised Oedipal wish fulfillment. It is certainly not hard to understand the Oedipal character of so much contemporary atheism and skepticism. Hugh Hefner, even James Bond, with their rejection of God, plus their countless young ladies, are so obviously living out Freud's Oedipal and primal rebellion. So are countless other skeptics who live out variations of the same scenario of exploitive sexual relationships combined with narcissistic self-worship. So I hope I've been able to show that you can use the psychoanalytic framework to explain why we should all be atheists. It's an unresolved Oedipus complex. Instead, it makes the simple, easily understandable claim that once a child or youth is disappointed in and loses his or her respect for their earthly father, then belief in a heavenly father becomes difficult or impossible. There are, of course, many ways that a father can lose his authority and seriously disappoint a child. Some of these ways for which clinical evidence will be given are: 1, he can be present, but obviously weak, cowardly, and unworthy of respect. 2, he can be present, but physically, sexually, or psychologically abusive. 3, he can be absent through death or by abandoning or leaving the family. Taken together, these 3 proposed determinants of unbelief will be called the defective father hypothesis. To support the validity of this approach, I will conclude by providing case history material from the lives of prominent unbelievers, for it was in reading the biographies of atheists that this hypothesis first struck me. We begin with Sigmund Freud's relationship to his own father. That Freud's father, Jakob, was a deep disappointment or worse is generally agreed to by his biographers. Specifically, his father was a weak man, unable to financially provide for his family. Instead, money seems to have been provided by his wife's family and others. Furthermore, Freud's father was passive in response to anti-Semitism. Freud recounts an episode told him by his father in which Jakob allowed an anti-Semite to call him a dirty Jew and to knock his hat off. Young Sigmund, on hearing the story, was mortified at his father's failure to respond. Sigmund Freud was a complex and in many ways ambiguous man, but all agreed that he was a courageous fighter and that he greatly admired courage in others. He once said that he says, "I'm not a scientist, I'm an intellectual conquistador." He admired courage in others. Sigmund, as a young man, several times physically stood up against anti-Semitism, and of course he was one of the greatest of intellectual fighters.